Swing Left Nebraska. We are the regional chapter of Swing Left, 100% run by grassroots volunteers dedicated to fighting for a more equitable, inclusive, and prosperous Nebraska and motivating Democratic leaning voters to vote. When we don't vote, when we don't get engaged, get involved, or stand up for what we believe in, we're effectively giving up our power. Action is the antidote. When we collaborate, work together, support each other, and our shared values, we can make our voices heard, make an impact, and inspire others to join the fight. Swing Left Nebraska offers you the information, actionable ideas, and tools you need to advocate for progressive legislation and to help elect Democratic candidates who will fight for the common good for all Nebraskans. Let's mobilize, let's take action, let's go. Welcome to a special Tuesday evening edition of the Swing Left Nebraska podcast, the show that brings you engaging discussions on politics, activism, and advocacy in Nebraska. I'm Leah, a volunteer with Swing Left Nebraska and your host. On today's episode, Cindy Maxwell-Ostdiek joins me to discuss updates to LB 754, the bill restricting healthcare, including gender related care for transgender youth and abortion care. We also chat about LB 753, the school choice bill, and LB 754, the individual tax cut bill. We have a lot to dive into, so let's do a show. Sydney, welcome back to the Swing Left Nebraska podcast. I appreciate your flexibility in our recording times for this, for all our listeners to be able to have up to date information and to have you on board to help us unpack everything unicameral. I was hoping you could explain what went down with LB 574, what the bill was, what the amendment was, for any of our first time listeners and our long time listeners, just to get a refresh.
Okay. There's so much to it, I know. And I just want to say thanks again so much for having me to visit about these things. I really appreciate all of the work you do to try to help us better understand what we should be doing here as everyday Nebraskan in the second house for our unicameral. It's unfortunate the senators at the Nebraska legislature did not listen to the second house regarding LB 574. And for people who, just as a refresher, 574 is Senator Cow's the Let Them Grow Act is what it's called. And that particular bill began to restrict transgender health care, gender affirming care for transgender youth, even though it is with parental consent and followed standard of care best practices. All major medical associations had opposed this legislation. Through the session, it continued to be the primary priority for the Republican senators, even facing a long filibuster process. They just continued to focus on that legislation. In the meantime, LB 626, which was Senator Albrecht's abortion ban bill, had failed. If you remember, Senator Reeby had an amendment he tried to add to it, which would have extended the time limit from 6 weeks to 12 weeks. And that particular amendment did have protections for doctors regarding criminal liability, and it also had exceptions for fatal fetal anomalies. That particular amendment wasn't considered, and 626 failed. Somehow, between that failing and the next step with 574, they decided to combine the two bills. And Senator Hansen introduced an amendment that brought 574 some changes to focus more on surgeries for transgender youth, to restrict that, and then to place extreme authority with the chief medical officer for the state regarding procedures that would limit the ability for doctors to prescribe puberty blockers and hormones to transgender youth, even with parental consent. So that chief medical officer process is still something that would be determined. 626 side of it, which was the abortion ban piece, Senator Hansen introduced. It was called 12 weeks, but it was really only 10 because abortion would be outlawed based on a person's previous menstrual cycle and not on fertilization. So it was essentially a 10-week ban. And it did not include exceptions for fatal fetal anomalies or protection regarding physicians and criminal liability. And that was something Senator Hansen and Senator Reeby discussed on the floor of the legislature, and they agreed that they would work on that next year. If the bill passed, they would go ahead and pass it with this, Senator Reeby's opinion, a deficiency, a flaw in the bill, that it would be passed and then addressed next year. And Senator Hansen assured Senator Reeby that he would do that. There were hundreds of people that showed up, not only during the select file round of debate regarding 574, but on final reading as well. And people were just begging the senators if they would come out and talk with them. There were emails, people were calling, there were letters to the editor, doctors were there in their white coats, so they would be easily identifiable to the senators, someone to speak with that had that medical expertise. And they just didn't listen. They didn't listen. And this bill passed with all 32 Republican votes, in addition to Democrat Senator Mike McDonnell. And it was really ghoulish to see that one of the senators that came back to vote on this bill was sick. Senator Slama was actually ill and came back to the legislature, I think from the hospital, to vote regarding healthcare for other pregnant women. And it came to light that Senator Slama was ill because she's pregnant and has a condition where it's, I don't know what the term of it is, but it's like some sort of violent nausea that can happen sometimes with pregnancy. And it's just really disturbing that people who would trust doctors with their own health would not listen to the medical professionals, all the credible medical associations regarding other Nebraskans' health. So it's very disappointing. And I know that there are devastated families, women across the state, and families with transgender youth. It's just been really difficult week. The signing ceremony with Governor Pellin was disturbing in that at one point during the signing ceremony, he talked about how transgender youth, their parents, and the medical professionals were somehow diabolical and under influence of Lucifer.
Yeah, I heard that. That is just so appalling. I don't even have the words
Yeah.
to reflect on that properly. It's
I,
just
it's it's
egregious.
it's really disturbing, and not one of the senators present spoke up or corrected the governor, and I've not seen any since come forward and say, no, we do not believe Nebraska families are possessed by Satan. It's alarming that this extremism has taken such hold in our legislature.
Can you remind the audience when these bills will go into effect? From my understanding, the abortion bill goes into effect, like it's in effect. It's
It's
done
already
in.
law.
Yeah.
It's law.
Okay.
Yes. The abortion side of LB 574 is law of Nebraska right now. And the procedures for trying to help transgender youth with their medications, that whole process is supposed to go into effect in October. But the newly appointed and not yet confirmed chief medical officer said during his confirmation hearing last week that might not be ready to go in October. So I don't really know what happens if the procedures aren't in place and there are doctors who want to prescribe medications to transgender youth. So I'm not sure what happens then, but it will not be something that can proceed legally without those procedures through the chief medical officer.
So could a child essentially still get prescribed this gender affirming medication right now?
If they're currently receiving it, if they're currently under this care, they're quote unquote calling it grandfather clause until October. And then someone could proceed from there. But anyone who would be newly prescribed this medication in October, if there's no procedure in place, it will effectively be a ban.
Wow. Wow. And we just learned hot off the press, the ACLU will be suing. I will be linking this article so you can read this in its full. But basically, it says no bill shall contain more than one subject. That language from the Nebraska state constitution is at the heart of Nebraska's new lawsuit by the ACLU that is challenging Nebraska's new abortion ban and new restrictions on gender related care for transgender youth. So the ACLU union and then the ACLU of Nebraska are representing Planned Parenthood of the Heartland and Dr. Sarah Traxler in the case. Traxler is the chief medical officer of Planned Parenthood, North Central States, and a physician who provides abortion. The lawsuit was filed in a state trial court in Lancaster County this morning as of recording May 30th. So that's been something I know Nebraskans have been keeping their eyes and ears peeled on to see when, not if, but when the ACLU was going to file a lawsuit. So that is comforting to know that they are taking this measure to the courts.
And, the thing, until there might be any indication from the courts that this would be either stayed or on hold, or I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the correct terms. It is important that Nebraskans understand that this law is in effect right now. I've been talking to so many people. I just will say this: if you are at all capable of becoming pregnant and you have any concerns about that, I think it's important that you regularly test at this point so that you would have the ability to work with your doctor regarding any care that you might need within the time constraints that are the current law here in Nebraska. And so this law went into effect, and there were many people in Nebraska that are pregnant right now and don't even know it.
Right.
It is important, if you're capable of becoming pregnant and you're concerned at all about that, that you be regularly testing.
And the fetal abnormalities part of this bill is so scary.
It really is.
Can you explain what that means to our audience?
Yes. And Senator Hansen was very clear about this, that it was deliberate, that the fatal fetal anomaly exception was not included with this bill because he and the other senators believe that all Nebraskans should be forced to carry their pregnancy to term, even if if the baby would be doomed as far as whether they could even make it to delivery or to die shortly after birth. It's really difficult and tragic situation. We just had seen a case out of Florida where there's a woman who was diagnosed with this fatal fetal anomaly. It's called Potter syndrome, I think is what it is. But basically, the baby's kidneys don't develop correctly. And so then there's difficulties with the amniotic fluid, and then their lungs don't develop either. And this particular woman, and many people, are not diagnosed with these situations until like their physical ultrasound. There's a ultrasound many people have like at the 20-week mark. They go in and they see what the gender is, and everything's healthy, and all the fingers and the toes. And usually it's hopefully very joyous, affirming type of appointment. And then unfortunately, though, there are people in those appointments that learn very tragic news. And that would be after the point in Nebraska where any doctor would be able to perform an abortion in those cases. So unless the mother's life would be in danger, we at this point will be forcing women to carry these doomed pregnancies. And I just really recommend that everyone try to be proactive about their health, working with their doctors, making sure they're up to date on all of their appointments. And if they're in that situation, working with their doctors to see if it might be necessary to receive care outside of Nebraska.
Absolutely. I think that's really important advice that you provided.
This is really hard because I've known people in these situations that there are some people that do prefer to carry their child to term and then hold their child closely or to be with their child as they die. And this particular legislation doesn't impact. That would always be any parent's choice. What this legislation does is it says that no one may make a different choice. And for many people, it's difficult because of just the sheer trauma. And there's many people who may have faith belief that they would want to end the pregnancy. There are people too who have other difficulties. Like maybe they're in the process where they're really trying to get pregnant. And this time that they're continuing this pregnancy is one that they're not readying their body to potentially try again. And when you're older, mom, or a person who's trying to get pregnant, these months are sometimes the difference between being able to successfully deliver a healthy baby. So it's really tragic that the state has decided that they're not going to listen to mothers. They're not going to listen to doctors. They're not going to listen to science or follow what has been happening in other states where these laws have passed. They refuse to listen. And unfortunately, there are going to be people caught up in this that are hurt.
Yeah, I think that that is inevitably going to be happening. We've already seen it in other states that have already implemented similar bans. This is, like you said, the time to really be mindful of your own health and reaching out to your friends and family and reminding them to be conscious of their reproductive health and to take special care more than ever. Now is the time. So let's pivot over to LB 753, the school choice bill or scholarship scheme, as other people refer this to. Tell me about that. That just passed.
This, again, it's another one where unfortunately the senators have not been following the data and looking at what's happened in other states where they've implemented this. And they were just determined. This is something Senator Linehan has worked on for years. And the unfortunate thing about LB sub 53 is that there are many people who think this will give them choice regarding where their child will be potentially accepted into private school. But the ability for these schools to discriminate based on ability, disability, and such things as sexual orientation or gender. It's just really unfortunate that any public tax dollars, which, you know, the school tax dollars that would be going to these public schools, but for this law are revenues that we're foregoing. I just really, if there's someone listening to this and you say these are tax dollars that never would have been in our coffers, that is because of the law. It's really just double speak. Those tax dollars are going to be going to organizations eventually because it would be for the student who would receive the scholarship. And those organizations are allowed to discriminate. And I think most Nebraskans don't really believe that's how our public school dollars should be handled. And the Nebraska State Education Association, which is the association of all of the public school teachers in our state, who most of us truly admire and really appreciate how well our teachers take care of our students and help develop Nebraska's future through our schools. They are helping everybody with an organization called Support Our Schools Nebraska. Its hashtag is SOSNE. And basically, what we're going to do is make sure and gather signatures to overturn this. And it is something that will be taking place immediately. 753 does not help all children. It does not help all taxpayers. In fact, there's limits to who can apply for this based on 25 million this first year. And the corporate and individual limitations are much lower than for estates and trusts. So those dollars will not be available to many families who believe that they're going to be receiving tax benefits. It's just really bad policy all the way around. So if you are interested in helping with that process, you can go to supportourschools.nebraska.org and you can help with gathering signatures so that we can get this on the ballot and overturn.
I will, of course, link that in the show notes for you so you can grab that if you want as well. Let's move on to LB 754. This was the corporate individual tax cuts. Now, this also passed. So, can you give us just an overview of that and update as to what this now means for Nebraskans?
So first, I'll say there's some good in this bill. And I think most of us like tax cuts. No one wants to pay taxes, correct? The sad thing and what I'm so very disappointed in is that the senators didn't roll up their sleeves and include all Nebraskans. not all taxpayers are included in these income tax cuts is disappointing. The corporate rates will actually be something that they've gone with a flat tax. Basically, after this is fully implemented, the corporate rates will be even across the different brackets. So the difficult thing about that, just like if it were for individuals, a flat tax is regressive. And so it doesn't really support our small businesses in Nebraska, which is just such an important driver for our economy. And so it is really disappointing that the senators didn't choose to support our small businesses in our state. When you look at the individual tax rates, the income tax brackets that receive a cut, it is only the top brackets for individuals. And it's very disappointing that the senators did not help all Nebraskans to take advantage of these tax cuts. And it's something that I believe is just fundamentally what most Nebraskans agree with. The child care tax credits that were included in this, the difficult thing is that they trimmed it so that it would budget wise and appropriation wise, the senators had to trim some of these packages because the forecasts weren't as rosy as we started out the beginning of the year. So one of the things they did is they trimmed the childcare tax credits, the amount that the revenue, Department of Revenue can make available overall. And the thing that is really disappointing about that is that really, when we tried to imagine how the senators focused their energy as far as tax policy in our state, they decided that working families were not the priority. I'm disappointed with how this turned out overall. I think there's some good pieces to it, but it is going to be really difficult for our state when inevitably we reach a downturn in our economy because, of course, it is cyclical.
And this is going into effect right away, too.
It's phased over years, but when it's fully implemented, which I think they on the fiscal mode is like 2027, it's going to be about $1 billion.
Okay.
So that's revenue that will not be available for services in our state. And one of the things that I know is going to be a real problem in a few years is when we start to see how, like 753, the effect it's going to have on our schools. There have been property tax plans that have been implemented, and all of these things are going to come together and coalesce. And it'll be very difficult if we reach a downturn in our economy and the revenue won't be there for the senators to make decisions that support working families and struggling Nebraskans. I don't mean
Right.
to be just such a downer. Well, you'd think it'd be good news to say we're going to cut taxes, but when we leave certain segments of our neighbors behind, it's just not good policy.
No, it's not good policy. It's giving the benefits to the highest earners and not giving it to people who really could benefit and could really use the money to help with just day-to-day needs. And at the end of the day, their money goes back into the economy as well.
I want to do a shout out to Senator Wendy DeBoer because she really focused on this and tried to help the senators to roll up their sleeves and work on that piece of it regarding working families. And they weren't having it. And I would also like to say that Senator Jane Raybould, a new senator who has a lot of business background and experience, she tried to bring guardrail amendments to some of these bills, and the majority weren't having that either. I hope that the results from these bills will be something that we don't feel right away or that cut too deep. Hopefully, we can come back next year and maybe even revise or try to improve some of these policies before they go fully into.
Here's to hoping. Here's to hoping. I know you wanted to touch on some of the vetoes. Let's dig into that.
I am so frustrated with the governor's vetoes because there were many items that I believe he is mistaken in his view and his reasoning, because that was made available his actual letter that he sent to the legislature regarding each line item that he vetoed. And it is really sad that, especially with the other policies that the majority has been focused on regarding restricting reproductive health care and all of these types of priority regarding children, that they would make the cuts they did, which were specifically for vulnerable children. Some of them, the most vulnerable, like with the CASA, the court appointed support of Nebraskans who help with these vulnerable children, that particular money. I'm like, where in the world they decide that is something we should focus on? There was a bill brought by Senator DeKay that had to do with clean water and also included an area of our state with the Santee lands. And those types of things are really troubling that the senators would pass this legislation. They worked so hard to try to get it through, even passed a filibuster, and to have the governor veto like this. And I'm not sure that the senators are going to come back and try to override all of them. I know that the appropriations committee was discussed in some news reports that they were planning on trying to mount an override of some. And then there's even in the news some kind of rumors that the legislature was considering actually ending the session early, which that is very worrisome to me. The session is actually towards the end right now. Today is the 86th day of the legislative session out of 90 days. And they're scheduled for tomorrow as well, which would be Wednesday, Thursday the 1st, and Friday the 2nd. And then they have 5 days off the whole next week until that next Friday the 9th. And those days are built into the schedule in case the legislature passes any bills that the governor would veto. The governor has a certain number of days that they can veto. And so those days of cushion built in there would allow the legislature to override any vetoes from the governor. So I really, truly do not believe that the legislature should close their session early until they're sure the governor has signed every piece of legislation that they have passed. And I would really recommend that everybody call their senator and let them know that is your thought as well. Because if we leave it up to chance, we've seen like with Governor Ricketts in the past, he vetoed legislation after the session ended and there was no chance to override.
I agree. I think it's important that we contact our senators and let them know that it is not the time to end the session.
I hope
So,
the legislators really do override the governor, especially regarding the provider rates. That was something that had been really focused on just like I've been following the legislature for years now. This is something that they've been working on even with the previous appropriations committee under Senator Stinner. So it's really sad to me that the governor would have reached into the budgeting process like that and as far as appropriations and vetoed something so important, especially to our rural healthcare and to disabled. And when you talk about children who have disabilities, and it's really sad that we would be focusing our veto on such things as vulnerable neighbors. So, yeah, these provider rates really do need to be fixed.
absolutely. Now, this weekend, we will be touching on the voter suppression, voter ID, and providing updates then, and then also updates on criminal justice reform. As we wrap up, is there anything that you would like to leave our listeners with?
I know a lot of people are disheartened and feeling very upset about how the legislature has worked out this session. And I feel it's important that everyone remember that the priority with the transgender youth care, the healthcare for youth, that priority was on the side of the Republicans, the majority. They prioritized that bill, even in the face of a very specific filibuster. And I know that there are a lot of people that are upset about all the legislation that could have passed or should have passed. There are many pieces that were buried within omnibus or what they call packages. They passed a whole bunch of Christmas tree bills. We'll need to dig in to some of those and see. I think there's some good stuff in some of these bills. And I feel like the legislature just really needs to go home this summer and really reflect over the fall and winter and come back next year fresh and ready to focus on ideals of nonpartisanship and on making sure that their focus is the priority for all Nebraskans, including our most vulnerable. And I hope that the people who listen will be in touch with their senators
Swing Left, Nebraska. We are the regional chapter. Need some information. Surely you can share this to put another plug to consider.
and on making sure that their focus is the priority for all Nebraskans, including our most vulnerable. And I hope that the people who listen will be in touch with their senators over the break and make sure and let them know their priorities because it's very difficult to imagine going into another session next year where the senators are so focused on restricting parental rights and restricting bodily autonomy. I know that they have a lot of other bills that are in the works. So it's important that we continue that work, being in touch with our senators and not letting up over these next few months.
I agree. And some other things to keep in mind is can't hurt to put another plug to consider a run for yourself. And also during this time, think about who you can register to vote. But think about people in your life that share similar values that may just need some information. Surely you can share this podcast with them, but just your one on one conversations about what has happened in our state and encouraging them to register to vote and to vote for senators, state, and federal representatives who most align with your values. We'll never ever find someone who aligns 100%. But for these big issues, the right to bodily autonomy and the right for parents to choose what kind of medical care they give their children, to other things that we have talked about on this podcast.
It would be good for everyone to make sure, especially when we think of young people that are just graduating, making sure that they're registered to vote and that if you know anyone who you're interested in supporting, that they get started now with next election. Get out there, write some postcards, canvas, hold a fundraiser, try to do phone calls or texts on behalf of candidates and really just help people learn how important it is to support good candidates fast and early so that they can really reach the voters in their districts and really try to make sure that they're ahead of the curve because it's a hard thing. Try to reach voters over a certain period of time. It takes a lot of work and effort, and starting soon is a good thing.
Absolutely. We will wrap this episode up. You can find us again this Sunday with another episode with updates on what has happened in the unicameral. Appreciate you joining us again. Sydney, we are just so grateful for all your time and energy and everything that you do to help us unpack everything unicameral. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode of the Swing Left Nebraska podcast. We hope you found it informative and inspiring. Cindy will join us again on Sunday to help us unpack everything unicameral. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss another episode and share it with your pals so we can get this information into the ears of Nebraskans. Remember, the work of creating positive change in our communities never stops. So let's stay engaged, stay informed, and keep working together towards a brighter future for all Nebraskans. Let's mobilize, let's take action, let's go.
Ready, set, go.
Oklahoma